Welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. If you're tired of censorship, outraged by government abuses, and thirsty for real insights, then you're in the right place. Get ready, because here, the fight for freedom never ends. Here's your host, Professor Nick Giordano.
Donald J. Trump is now President of the United States. Mr. Trump, for the moment, steps forward for the inaugural address.
What a great honor to be able to introduce the 35th President of the United States of America, Donald
So sorry.
This is your host, Nick Giordano, and what you just heard was the complete meltdown of the media, the establishment, the Democratic Party, the never-Trumpers, and the bureaucracy, all who are still in a meltdown phase over the resounding victory for President Donald Trump, the 45th and now 47th President of the United States. Now, if you're not already a subscriber, make sure to subscribe and follow the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, don't forget to visit the P.A.S. Report website and share this episode with your family and friends, because the 2024 election is now in the books. It's over. And I don't think people fully grasp the gravity of what just happened. Not only did President Trump decisively win the Electoral College, but he also became the first Republican in nearly 40 years to secure a majority of the popular vote. Now, some of you may be thinking that it was George W. Bush in 2004 that did, but understand, he did not win a true majority of the popular vote. His popular vote number was 49.4%. The last Republican to win a majority of the popular vote was George H.W. Bush. You got to go all the way back to 1988, so make no mistake, this isn't just a win. It's a historic mandate, and it's even more remarkable given the relentless opposition he faced. And I want everyone to think about this. Trump managed to sweep the swing states and win the popular vote despite an unprecedented $2 billion spent against him. $2 billion, despite an advocacy press corps that essentially functioned as an extension of the Kamala Harris campaign, where she was getting 90% media coverage, positive media coverage, while Trump was faced with 90% negative coverage. He was able to succeed in spite of Hollywood star power, an entire industry pushing to influence how people should vote. He was able to win despite the Swifties. He won despite enduring constant comparisons to Hitler, accusations of fascism, despite the outright lies of very fine people or the bloodbath hoax. He prevailed despite several years of lawfare from a weaponized government, a weaponized bureaucracy, a relentless bureaucratic assault on him. 4 criminal indictments, 4 civil suits. Laws changed so that civil suits could be brought against him. He won despite the fraudulent national security experts out there who repeatedly interfered in the last 3 election cycles. In spite of all this, he pulled it off. That is remarkable. And his victory is full of ironies. You have one irony, that if it wasn't for the lawfare campaign, Trump might not have even been the Republican nominee. There were so many Republicans that were moving towards DeSantis, looking to turn the page on Trump. But the second New York District Attorney Alvin Bragg brought this case, that was it. That solidified Trump as the Republican nominee. So thank you, Alvin Bragg. Thank you very much. Talk about ironic. Another irony is how some in the media and Democratic circles are now blaming President Biden for waiting too long to exit the race. Are you kidding me? These same figures, the same Democrat elites and the media figures who conspired to hide his obvious decline for years. For years. Well, maybe if you didn't hide that cognitive decline, maybe he wouldn't have ran for re-election to begin with. Then there's the irony of how Trump, labeled as a racist, labeled as someone who hates minorities, how he won the popular vote precisely because of his increased support among black and Hispanic voters. After years of being painted as the Grand Wizard of hate, the Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, Trump secured the largest share of the black vote for a Republican candidate since Nixon in 1972. He secured the largest Hispanic vote share since George W. Bush. He even made double-digit gains amongst Jewish voters despite the relentless accusations that he was the second coming of Hitler. So with the overwhelming victory, you might expect that Democrats, the media, the never-Trumpers, and the other loons out there, you might expect that they finally engage in some self-reflection. But that's a foreign concept to them. Instead, they're blaming, of all things, democracy. It's democracy's fault because you, the ordinary Americans out there, had a right to push back on all the BS. You, the ordinary Americans, saw through the rhetoric. You saw through the propaganda. You saw through the lies. And because you, the American people, ordinary Americans out there, because you get to engage in the system, it's your fault now. You're the reason to blame. If you didn't have the right to vote, well, then none of this would have happened. The self-anointed guardians of democracy could have selected the candidate that they wanted. And now they're saying that black men hate black women, that black men are driven by racism and misogyny. They're accusing women of internalized misogyny, that they listen to their husbands and that they're forced to vote this way, that uneducated white women, they don't care about minorities, and that's why they voted for Trump. They're blaming toxic masculinity and the uneducated of society, the unenlightened masses that back Trump, while the enlightened PhDs in academia supported Kamala Harris. But here's the irony. This is exactly why they lost. Americans are fed up with being insulted. They're fed up with being demeaned, constantly put down by these elites. If you listen to Kamala Harris's concession speech, she implied that Americans are simply too ignorant to understand how well the Harris-Biden economy was working for them. As if American struggles with the skyrocketing grocery bills and household finances, it's just a figment of our imaginations. We're just too dumb to realize. They simply don't get the fact that constantly denigrating Americans, constantly calling them racist, bigoted, uneducated, that's not a winning campaign strategy. Constantly telling them that they're from this evil, horrible, terrible country, it's not going to win you an election. And the American people, in the face of this, stood up and said, we're not listening to you anymore. We're not going to pay attention to you anymore. And that's going to be the focus of this episode. I want to talk about how America has fundamentally changed. Or maybe it's not changed. Maybe it's actually shifted back to a sense of normalcy. And we're in abnormal times, and Trump is an abnormal candidate. I mean, that's putting it mildly. But he's the right person for the right times to maybe bring us back to our traditional roots. Before I jump into it all, we have to take a quick break, so everyone hang tight, and then we'll be right back. Welcome back to the P.A.S. Report podcast. Now, if you've been listening to this podcast for the last few months, you would have heard me say that this election is a coin toss, that it's extremely difficult to predict who's going to win this election. And it wasn't a coin toss. It was an overwhelming defeat. It was very difficult to predict because, as I was stating in previous episodes, the polling simply wasn't making sense to me. That you had this 1 to 2 point race that would constantly shift back and forth, both nationally and in the swing states, and it would be Trump up 1 point, maybe Kamala Harris up 1 point, maybe down a point. But it never left that. However, we were looking at other polls, and I explained the polls that we were seeing from black voters. I explained polls we were seeing from Hispanic voters, that with the black vote, he was getting 20% of their vote. With the Hispanic vote, he was getting, in the lower 40s, maybe mid 40% of their vote. And I stated it on the podcast that if those polls are accurate, I don't see how this is a close race. I don't see how the Democrats can actually win. That's part of their core constituency. So the signs were there if we were paying attention to them. The signs of this political upset did exist. And one of the interesting things was we sampled a few of the classes at the college. A few of us professors got together and we gave a survey to a number of students. It was probably about 500 students in all, maybe a little bit more. So it wasn't a large sample size, and it wasn't that we were looking for it to be reflective of the United States. But the sample that we got, the survey results, were really interesting because it turned out that more women, young adult women, completed the survey than men. And their selections were interesting. You saw the economy ranking high, you saw crime ranking high, the problems with immigration ranking high, but even more shocking was the fact that they were supporting Trump by wide margins. And again, these are young college students. Most of the ages were between 18 to 24. And it turns out that that was actually kind of reflective of the way society voted. Another early warning sign for Democrats was the early vote count. People expected this to be like 2020, but this isn't 2020. This is not the coronavirus. Not everyone is getting mailed a ballot anymore. That's done. More importantly, you have states that actually passed laws to provide more election integrity, to secure their elections. And when I was looking at the early vote returns, which Trump and the Republicans were encouraging, one of the stark differences were how much the Democrat returns fell off. In Pennsylvania alone, 2020, it was 1.7 million early votes cast for Joe Biden. Well, 2024, it was only 900,000 early votes that were cast for Joe Biden. In 2020, Democrats had about a million vote advantage in the early voting in Pennsylvania. Well, this time it was only 417,000. Republicans were leading in early voting in North Carolina, Nevada, Arizona, to name a few, and Georgia. And so watching those returns, I knew something was different. And then Election Day came, and I started to notice something was going on. Something was changing. And I noticed it early on. I was actually on a space on X, and I explained to the audience, and this was probably about 2 o'clock, and I said, pay attention to the youth vote, because I'm witnessing something that's really interesting with this younger voting demographic. They are trending more conservative, and that it's not easy to just lump them in as men versus women, that you can't do that. Was it that maybe these young people are bitter and resentful that 2 years of their lives was stolen from them? Now that we're removed from the coronavirus, were they looking back and saying that a lot of Democrat officials inhibited them when it came to their education, when it came to social development? And then the exit polling started to come in. And that was a big red alert for Democrats. Not only was it red alert for Democrats, a lot of times exit polling doesn't always trend with election results. 32% of the respondents felt that the economic conditions of the country were good or excellent, whereas 67% felt that they were not so good and poor. When it comes to the family's financial situation compared to 4 years ago, only 24% of the people said that they were better off today than they were 4 years ago. 45% said they were worse off than they were 4 years ago. When it comes to inflation, 75% of the American people responded that they either have a severe or moderate hardship, where only 24% said the inflation's not affecting them. I wonder who the elites are in the society, huh? When you look about the way things are going in the country, only 7% were enthusiastic and thought the country was headed in the right direction. You have 43% who were dissatisfied with the direction of the country, with the way things are going. 29% were actually angry with the way things were headed in this country. When it came to the actual issues, 51% believed Donald Trump would handle the economy better. 52% believed he would handle immigration better. 51% believed he would handle crime and safety better. 50% to Kamala Harris's 45% on who do you trust more to handle a crisis. But one of the major surprises in the NBC exit polling was that democracy was the top issue of voters concerned, and Trump actually won those voters. We've been hearing about these threats to democracy from the left, the media industrial complex, and the Democrats for the last several years. But it turns out that the American people see through them. The American people recognize that the threat to democracy are the ones that encouraged lockdowns for 2 years, are the ones that kept kids out of school for nearly 2 years, the ones that enforced vax mandates that would destroy livelihoods if you didn't comply with those mandates, the ones that masked up our children. It's the ones that determined what businesses are essential and which ones aren't. It's the ones that constantly push the idea of censorship and want to regulate what you can and cannot say, what you can and cannot see, what you can and cannot hear. The American people saw through the nonsense. So when the exit polls started rolling in at about 6 o'clock, I started to look at that and I was like, hey, something's going on here. I think we're going to know by the end of the night who's going to win the election. And then the polls began to close. And again, as a political scientist, there are certain things I look at. I have the county maps from 2020 out. I have the results of the 2020 in each county. I'm looking at the maps of this county. And then they call New Jersey. The New Jersey polls closed, and they call it. And I begin to look at the numbers from New Jersey because something stood out to me. If you go back to 2020, President Biden won New Jersey by 16 points. 16 points. This time, Kamala Harris only won it by about 5 points. That is a dramatic difference. And when I started going county by county throughout the country, it was clear what was going on. Kamala Harris was underperforming everywhere, and Donald Trump was overperforming where he was in 2020. And again, I was on Next Space, and I stated, it's not going to change. When everyone was looking, it's trending in Trump's direction, but we have to be careful, and we don't want to get too overconfident. All the data, all the evidence was showing that there wasn't going to be a reversal like we saw in 2020 where Trump was ahead and then all of a sudden voting count stops and ballots get dumped and you see this huge swing. That wasn't going to happen. And it was pretty clear early on that Trump was going to dominate the map. Not only did he dominate, he swept the swing states pretty much. Not only did they sweep the swing states, Republicans took control of the Senate. They're going to take control of the House if they haven't already. And this is a mandate election. This is not Trump 2016 going in with the Democrat candidate that won the popular vote and Trump eked by with the Electoral College vote. This is a mandate. The American people have said enough. We're tired of the wokeness. We're tired of the nonsense. We're tired of being accused of being racist and bigots. And we're tired of America constantly being slandered. And it was a thorough rejection of leftist policies, leftist politicians, and the attempt to move the United States to the far left. And I want to talk about that when we get back from this quick break, because we do have to analyze why Kamala Harris, the Vice President of the United States, lost this election. You have to understand, given everything that was behind her, given all the support behind her and the dollars behind her, it's a big deal that she lost. And Democrats should be doing soul searching, but they're not as of right now. So hang tight. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the P.A.S. report. And now let's examine why Kamala Harris lost. Democrats are trying to play the blame game and they're all pointing fingers. You have the media that's doing the same thing. But there are several reasons why they lost. Most notably, Kamala Harris was a terrible candidate. And it's not because Americans wouldn't vote for a black person. They obviously voted for Obama in both 2008 and 2012. It's not because she's a woman. Every American I know will pretty much vote for a woman as long as the woman is competent. The reason that they rejected Kamala Harris is because she is the most inauthentic candidate that has ever ran for the presidency of the United States. She's not a real person. The one thing about Trump, many love him, many hate him. There's not a single person out there that calls him fake. He is who he is. He's going to say what he believes. He's going to say what he thinks. He's not going to sit there and put on fake accents depending on the audience he's speaking to. He's going to tell you what's on his mind, where Harris is the exact opposite. Nobody knows who the real Kamala Harris is. So you have that problem right there. The second problem that you have with Kamala Harris, she's incompetent. She has always been incompetent. I mean, understand, her entire campaign, she constantly talked about being from a middle-class family, dreams and aspirations. But most importantly, she hardly referenced her time as a senator, because she didn't do anything as a senator. She didn't reference her time as vice president. She would constantly reach back to when she was the Attorney General of California a decade ago. And so, again, who is the real Kamala Harris? She ran in 2019. She couldn't even make it to the first primary state. She had to drop out. And then she was just slotted in. Never had a primary, never able to fine-tune her messaging. And that certainly hurt her. She is incapable of original thoughts. She didn't really have policy positions. The only thing that she was able to speak about with any level of confidence was abortion. That's the only issue. Her economic plans were pretty much non-existent. They were totally unrealistic. They didn't make any sense. The only thing she was able to talk about was abortion. And it seemed that Democrats put all their chips on the abortion issue. But see, that only works so much. That might have helped them in 2022 when the Dobbs decision was first rendered. But the abortion issue is becoming baked into the cake. It's still going to exist, but it's not going to play this important role. And here's the failure of the Democrat logic out there, because I kept on seeing post after post after post about mothers and fathers. I'm voting for the future of my daughter. I'm voting to protect my daughter's right of whether or not she wants to get an abortion or not. But here's the thing. Most normal mothers and fathers, they don't sit there thinking about their daughter getting knocked up and is going to need an abortion. In fact, most women, the overwhelming majority of women in the United States, will never, ever, ever get an abortion. Ever. And any normal parent out there, any good parent out there, would speak to their children about these types of issues so that it doesn't happen. And parents are much more concerned about things like drug use amongst kids. That's a far bigger concern, because far more kids will encounter drugs as they're growing up than they will about making a choice of whether or not to get an abortion. So the abortion messaging wasn't making sense. The constant demonization of males for women power didn't make sense either. And I keep on seeing that men hate women. That's the Democrat messaging. Men despise women. And that's why they voted for Trump. Well, no, millions of women actually supported the former president and the president-elect. Millions of women. And what these morons didn't understand were that women have sons also. And they don't want to constantly see males being denigrated. They don't want to see their sons being accused of horrible people for things that they never did. Then you look at the messaging coming from people like Michelle Obama. Don't let your husbands dictate who you vote for. Keep it a secret from them. No, there are plenty of marriages where they have healthy marriages, that husbands and wives can interact with each other, where they don't judge each other, where a husband values the opinion of their wife. And if their wife wants to vote for someone else, they're not going to stop their wife from doing that. But yet, at every level of the way, you have Democrats making spouses, trying to make spouses suspicious of each other, that somehow their spouses are horrible people if you don't vote for Trump. And so there's a lot of women that say, no, maybe my husband's a good person. I don't like the way you're categorizing him. You have the Kamala Harris ads where women look at each other. You have this angry husband behind a woman making sure that she's going to vote for Trump. And then you have two women look at each other, and then a woman looks at her daughter, and they end up, circling that box for Kamala Harris. You have another Kamala Harris commercial where you have two butch men, the man's man, that go and vote. And he's looking, and he looks at his daughter, and so he fills in the box for Vice President Kamala Harris. And then he looks up at the other man, and they just nod to each other. Think about the messaging that's sent. Well, it's not really an effective winning message, is it? That we have to view each other with suspicion? That we can't trust each other? We can't talk to each other? They want to talk about division. Think of the division that they create with their messaging. And so it fell flat. It didn't work. The constant demonization. Trump is Hitler. Trump is a fascist. Republicans want to take you away your rights. It didn't work. It was a failure. But they had nothing else to run on. They didn't have policies to run on. They didn't have a campaign message. Understand, elections aren't really that complicated. Campaigns aren't complicated. The way people vote isn't complicated. People go to the polls and they ask themselves, is my life going to improve if I vote for this candidate or that candidate? And obviously, more voters felt that their life is going to improve under a Donald Trump administration as opposed to a Kamala Harris administration. So she was a terrible candidate to start with. And I said that at the beginning, that the only reason that they probably anointed her is so they don't have to deal with her in 2028. Maybe they figured they could live with another Trump presidency, but they wanted to throw her under the bus. But then when they did anoint her and she started making waves and this idea of joy came, then they thought, well, maybe she could actually pull this off. Maybe we could pull this off for the American people. And I said over the summer, her polling peaked. The more Americans see of her, the more they're not going to like her. And they have rejected her. Again, it's not because she's a woman. It's not because she's a black person or an Indian person or whatever you want to classify her as. It's because they viewed her as not fit to be the president of the United States. And you could sit there and say all you want. Well, Trump is a convicted felon, and Trump sexually abused women, and Trump did this, and Trump did that, and it doesn't fly anymore. All that's baked into the cake. Understand, Trump's polling numbers throughout the entire election have never changed. He's been roughly the same. The American opinion of Donald Trump is already baked into the cake. Kamala Harris had to introduce herself to the American people, and she wasn't able to do that because she's not real. She is a phony. While they're sitting there making it as if abortion's the only issue that exists, I'm sitting there, I'm voting for my daughter. I'm voting so that my daughter has a right to choose. Well, I'm voting for my sons, and I'm voting for the children of all Americans, that I don't want to see a World War III. I don't want to see our sons and daughters go off to faraway battlefields because the lunatics in the national security arena and the defense arena want to get us into a war with Russia. I was voting against an overbearing and abusive federal bureaucracy that needs to be dismantled. A bureaucracy that has way too much power over our lives. A bureaucracy and bureaucrats that think they could do whatever the hell they want when they want without consequence. And some of you may have been voting for those same things. I was voting an end to the censorship regime, to the constant weaponization of misinformation and disinformation, constantly classifying Americans as potential domestic violent extremists all because they disagree politically with other people. I was voting against that. But the overwhelming majority of Americans were voting against a failed economy, because that's exactly what it is. It's a failed economy. Yes, the stock market has done well under Biden, but most people don't have money in the stock market. The stock market is not reflective of real life and what people are facing in their lives. Millions of Americans did vote to protect women and girls, to protect them from men competing in their sports, to protect them from men stealing scholarship monies that they earned, to protect them so that they could go into a bathroom in peace and not worry about some creepy guy standing there staring at them, maybe trying to assault them, whatever it may be. That's what the American people voted for. The American people voted against this diversity, equity, inclusion nonsense, where Americans are just lumped into groups of people, and then those groups are pitted against each other. Again, this was just a thorough rejection of leftist politics, of leftist policies. And either the media and Democrats and Hollywood and the elites, either they begin to self-reflect or they're going to push themselves further and further to irrelevancy. And it will be glorious to watch. Now, I do want two strong, vibrant parties. However, the Democrat Party has done enormous damage to itself, and it continues to do damage. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens. But the fight is not over. Remember the episode I did last week? Okay, the bureaucracy does not want Trump to be the president of the United States. That much is clear. And who knows how far they'll push to prevent that from happening. Now, it's much more difficult for them to do anything because of the margins that Trump won by. So I don't anticipate that they're going to try and prevent him from taking the oath of office, but they're still going to try and undermine him. But more importantly, we have to begin to hold Republicans accountable, and we have to begin to hold Republicans' feet to the fire, including the 47th President of the United States, Donald Trump, to start to dismantle the bureaucratic apparatus that has become abusive, oppressive, and lost sight of the people that they took an oath to serve. We have to hold the feet to the fire to make sure that we have a government that is fiscally responsible, a government that uses our tax dollars wisely, a government that starts tackling our national debt. We have to be the one to hold our party, the Republican Party, conservatives, accountable for when they deviate from conservative principles of limited government, of concepts like liberty and freedom. So there still is a lot of work to do, and I'll cover that more in next week's episode about what a Trump presidency might look like. But for now, everyone could take solace because maybe some semblance of normalcy is coming back to the United States. Maybe it wasn't 2016 that was the biggest FU to the political class. Maybe it's 2024 that is really the biggest FU to the political class. And maybe it'll start opening some of these people's eyes. Now, if you find the content of this episode informative, please give the P.A.S. Report a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Share it with your friends and family. Take 30 seconds to write a review. Make sure to visit the P.A.S. Report website, PASreport.com. And then tune in next week. I got some great episodes lined up. You're not going to want to miss them. For now, I want to thank you for joining me, and I'll be back next week with another great episode of the P.A.S. Report podcast.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report. Don't forget to rate, share, and hit that subscribe button. That way you'll never miss an episode. For more exclusive content and updates, visit us at pasreport.com and follow Professor Giordano on all social media platforms at P.A.S. Report.